Buongiorno Davide.
Buongiorno, ciao Federica, come stai?
Buongiorno, molto bene, grazie.
Tutto
Siamo
bene?
già online. Ehm, Ti presenterò
We
brevemente
are
anche se non
online.
chiedi presentazioni. Lo farò in inglese per il nostro
You
pubblico.
don't need any introduction, but I'm going to
The
introduce you
President of the
anyway.
European Parliament just joined us, David Sassoli, a good friend of mine, President of the European Parliament since the last European elections, member of the European Parliament since, if I'm not wrong, 2009. Before that, a very well-known Italian journalist that has had important responsibilities in leading the main news, the main channel in Italy. And so an excellent communicator, which is not a bad issue when you have to try to bridge the gap of understanding between the institutions in Europe and the citizens. David has very kindly accepted to join us to deliver his keynote speech and then to answer questions. For us, it has been symbolically extremely important to ask him, the President of the European Parliament, to introduce our conference on the future of Europe. Because we know that the institutional conference on the future of Europe will have important tasks to respond to. There is a high expectation from European citizens, but also from the rest of the world, that this conference delivers. And we trust the European Parliament to lead this process in the most transparent, inclusive way to ensure ownership as much as possible from citizens of the future of Europe. In the College of Europe, we work on that. We work with the next generation of Europeans and not only. And so this is the natural place for us to discuss, debate, and to contribute to the institutional debate with the ideas not only of academia, but also of our students that are willing and ready to take the lead in shaping the future of Europe in these years and decades. With that, I leave the floor to the President of the European Parliament. David, la parola è tua e grazie per essere con noi.
Bene.
Thank you, Federica. And good morning to all the students, all the young people. Thank you for the invitation. I am very pleased to be able to be with you and share some thoughts in a moment that is particularly harsh and for the lives of our citizens in our countries. We've had a year particularly intense, shall we say, because none of us would ever have thought that the planet might come to a standstill. It wasn't just our countries and cities that came to a standstill, but the entire planet. And this has led to very onerous choices, and particularly the definition of some strategies on the part of the EU to be able to shoulder the burden of the pandemic and the crisis that has come out of the pandemic. We are still in the pandemic. We're not out of it yet. We are still going through the propagation of the virus. We have adopted certain measures such as vaccination, such as coming up with programs to support an economy that is struggling, but we still have to be aware of the fact that we're fully in the crisis and the repercussions will be with us for quite a while, and they will be quite heavy, and our economies are particularly adversely affected. And I think we will see social issues, very important social problems coming out. Right now, we are active on two fronts. First, obviously, the answer to the pandemic, which is a very dire crisis. And at the same time, we are working so that the answers we bring to the crisis does not weaken our identity All the EU institutions have said so from the beginning of the crisis, talking even with a single voice, which doesn't always happen in the European dialogue. We said that we wanted to face the crisis with democracy, with our values, with consistency and transparency, which are the characteristics that make the EU rather unique right now in the world. You will have seen in the media, you will have read in newspapers, that there are very many currents that tend to think that autocracy is more effective and efficient than democracy. And there have been a lot of debates on the pandemic and the crisis that the pandemic has brought about. And everyone is talking about whether autocracy or democracy is more effective. This is a subject that is very close to our heart, because if we let go of our values, we will have abdicated our identity. And right now, European identity is particularly important. The overall effects throughout the world that the pandemic has brought about show us that democracy has to be more efficient, because crises have to be faced with full transparency. But all around the world, if you have a paradigm that keeps together fundamental rights, such as the defense of freedom, of the dignity of an individual, the fundamental rights of an individual, well, this is a paradigm that isn't very often found around the world. And Europe can be the reference for others as well. So we have a huge responsibility, join the response to the crisis to the strengthening of our democratic model. The crisis has brought to light a lot of concerns and questions. We have understood that we have to renew ourselves. We have realized that democracy is fragile and has to be taken care of. Everyone has started this year looking at what was happening on the Capitol in Washington. We were all looking at what was happening in Washington, and what have we understood? That we need very strong antibodies to defend our institutions, protect our freedoms. We were obviously quite pleased to see that the United States of America has an immune system and antibodies strong enough to repel certain attempts. But we've also understood that that bell could toll for us as well. And so we have sped up the thinking process that we had started already at the beginning of the crisis with the Council and the Commission. We want to strengthen democracy to face the crisis. We have been particularly fortunate, and perhaps not everybody realizes this in the public debate in our countries. We have been quite fortunate that we got to the crisis last March within a context that already had certain solid points, because there was a proposal by the EU Commission that was then accepted by the Parliament on the European Green Deal to try and save the planet, to try and make men and women live better on our planet. It's not just an environmental problem. It's also a social problem, an economic problem. So with that proposal in place, COVID struck. And so we were lucky enough that we already had that one tool that allowed us to then develop other tools so that we could bring together everybody's goals. Today, we have fielded a toolbox that can allow everyone to converge their efforts so that we can help our economies to start up again, but also to strengthen Europe. And what does it mean to strengthen Europe? With COVID, we have seen the gaps and lacks that certain previous choices had brought about. Europe is more fragile than it used to be. It is less resilient. This is an important aspect right now, and we really feel it. You will have seen it in the simplest daily things. We realized last March that we had given up a lot of manufacturing in the European area. A lot of low-cost manufacturing we left outsourced to other areas of the world, to countries with lower costs. So resilience is actually a premise that allows one to be independent. We have to really work hard to be independent and autonomous. Last year, we were drawing up certain instruments, and we understood that we could have common policies to face the crisis, especially, like I was saying, if we converge on common objectives. But we still have to keep working on two levels: answer the crisis and strengthen democracy. At the beginning of this legislature, about a year and a half ago, we had already pointed out that we needed to perfect our democratic process and start a big initiative, the one that Federica was quoting, the Conference on the Future of Europe. And why? Well, first of all, to start a true dialogue with civil society, with our citizens, with the national institutions of all 27 member states. If we need and want to find improvements, we must do so together, talking to each other. We don't want them to sort of drop down from the sky and the top. A more participative Europe can start with this sort of spirit, and a conference on the future of Europe can give some very important indication for future policies. Obviously, we are lagging a little behind if we look at the original calendar, and we realize, but it's been an odd year, to say the least, and our heads and hearts were occupied elsewhere in fighting COVID. Now we are more ready. And so I was very pleased last week to meet with Mr. Costa, the Portuguese Prime Minister, who is now the head of the the presidency of the European Council, because I wanted to hear from him what he wanted for this presidency. This conference needs to be a storm that allows our citizens to take part in defining what should be a future Europe, to concentrate and propose changes to our rules, to place civil society and true participation at the core of what is happening. We do not want Brussels and its institutions to be seen as something remote and not an integral part of everyday life. We want Brussels and its institutions to be the end point of a participation that we've seen decrease over the years and sort of put in vain the EU efforts. So it should be a season of proposals and dialogue, but who with? We are convinced that if we are able to really have this dialogue, we can do it 360 degrees with all sorts of stakeholders. I'm thinking about our university and research center networks, citizens associations, NGOs, national parliaments, national political parties, trade unions. We want to develop a conference that really wants to nourish a debate focused on our common future. It is very important, I think, to most of all signal that Europe wants to strengthen its identity, wants to update its mechanisms. At the beginning of the year, as I was saying earlier, we saw how a large democracy has its weak points. And I'm very pleased that in his inaugural speech, President Biden used the same expressions that we use when we talk of democracy as a fragile system, because obviously authoritarianism is much stronger. It can be a lot stronger, but democracy and its strength has to be updated within and with the context. If we think back of this past year and the life of our institutions even, all the rules we've had to change. For example, not to close the European Parliament, to keep it open. Keeping the Parliament open has meant that we were able to not block the European response, the use of technology, the use of our regulations. These are examples. If we want that a fragile system such as democracy is still a pertinent answer, we need to change some of its aspects. We need to especially be able to see what changes might be useful right now. There's a lot of work to do. And a college such as yours could be useful to all of us. Let's all feel that we take part in a common destiny. Let's all feel that we are involved in putting something down on a blank page because we don't want anybody else to write it for us. I remember when we started this legislature a year and a half ago, there was an important interview of President Putin with an American newspaper, and he insisted on the fact that nowadays it's quite clear that democratic systems were outdated. No, I do not agree. I do not believe that they're outdated and outmoded. I believe that democracy can still preserve and build our freedoms. And Europe, in this, is really unique. Perhaps we're not proud enough. And this is one of our shortcomings. I believe the conference on the future of Europe might be able to raise the level of our pride in a project such as the European project. A lot of citizens admire this project, even citizens outside the European sphere. So many would like to be like us. We don't want to impose anything on anyone, let me be clear. But we want to be able to be proud of how far we've come in 70 years. Our countries have found peace. And perhaps today, this might allow Europe to become a true instrument for peace in the world. Without wanting to impose anything on anyone, the fact that so many admire the European construction, which has been so difficult, so slow, but so important, we can be a beacon, an example, and it could be for us the engine that we need to go on. We need more Europe. I think this has been made quite clear from the year we've just gone through. Thank you.
Grazie, David. Thank you to you. I think you underlined not only the starting points and the expectations for the conference on the future of Europe, on which I'm sure the many questions that are arising already will focus, but also if I can come back to a couple of points you raised that I think in these times are very important. One is the need to be proud of what we have managed to build in these years. Questo orgoglio europeo, if I can say it in Italian. I've seen it in the eyes of so many interlocutors in the world, and I think in Europe we realize it less than they realize it outside of the European Union. And also this need to develop ownership, the sense that Europe is what you make of it, and that there is no Europe without European citizens. And this is all about this. So we have now almost 400 participants online, so it will be challenging to gather their questions. We will try to do our best, but first I would start by passing the floor to Professor Costa, that is our Director of the Department of Political Studies here at the College of Europe, to kick off the questions. And again, grazie David per il tuo magnifico contributo questa mattina.
Thank you, David, for this fantastic contribution this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will not comment on your speech and keep time for questions. Many young people are watching us today, and they need to be reassured about what we do in the EU, because at some point, maybe they are in doubt. My first question is about the strategy of the European Parliament. During the Convention on the Future of Europe in 2002 and 2003, the European Parliament has had a very efficient strategy towards the Convention because of the involvement of many of its members, also the mobilization of the staff, the mobilization of the Committee of Constitutional Affairs. Could you tell us about the strategy of the European Parliament regarding the conference on the future of Europe that should be launched next May?
Yes, of course. First of all, we don't talk about convention. We're talking about a process that might lead to a whole score of ways in which we can intervene in our mechanisms. And to do so, together with the European Commission, we have thought to go ahead with a conference with citizens and associations, a conference of Europeans who are wondering about themselves. This was the starting point. We know that there are a lot of mechanisms that need to change. We've seen it this year as well. One for all, the right of veto. Obviously, it's becoming anachronistic and outdated. We need an efficient and effective democracy. But if democracy itself blocks its own decisions, how can it be quick and efficient? How can it face the issues that come up? It becomes just a bureaucratic monster that just feeds itself. And this is not what we want. And we don't want this to go on. And we've also understood that global challenges need to be met really quickly. So we know that we need to fix a lot of things. But we don't want to just make a shopping list, because right now this isn't of any use. We need to increase the awareness that Europeans want to reflect of about what it means to be European, that they want to see what changes the democratic structures need. This is what we need to do. We don't know where the conference will lead us. It might lead us to focus on legislative initiatives. It might lead us to start a convention. It could give us a lot of possibilities to act. But what we want to do is rebuild the relationship between the institutions and the civil society, which is why immediately we thought of putting together Citizens Agora, so that all the vital expressions of our societies could be aired. And this is very important, and we've never worked on it enough, is to tie in the experience of European institutions to those of national institutions. If there is one lesson that COVID has taught us, and I am very pleased to see that the spirit of the European institutions has not been impose behaviors, models, and tools to national governments, was just to suggest a range of possibilities. This means that Europe is not just Brussels and its institutions, not just the Parliament, the Commission, the Council of Ministers. No, Europe is not just the institutions in Brussels. Europe is also national parliaments, national political parties, national governments, regions. If there is another lesson that COVID has taught us, is the importance of regions. We have seen every national government discussing and fighting with their regions. It's happened in Germany between the federal government and the Länder. It's happened in Italy between the national government and the regions. It's happened in Spain. We see that regions are getting back their identity, and we need to be able to use this. I'm not saying that everything is hunky-dory, but I am saying that Europe is not just Brussels and its institutions. And if we want a stronger Europe, we must do everything we can so that everyone feels that they're a cog in this mechanism. We don't want to be a deus ex machina. We want to be a part of it. And that's why we wanted to start this conference. And then we know that the list of what needs to change will be very long and will touch on a lot of aspects. But we do not want to have it drop from the top. That's why the young people, parties, associations, citizens' movements, we have an extraordinarily vital fabric in Europe that we have to use.
Grazie, David. To let this fabric express itself starting from this morning, I would suggest now that Karine helps us gathering 2 or 3 questions from the floor, from the participants, so that you can address them together. Karine, pass it to you.
Thank you. Buongiorno, Presidente Sassoli, è un piacere di vederla stamattina. Grazie mille per la sua presenza. Dunque, I will continue in English.
Bene.
Okay. We got for now 2 kind of questions, so I will group them according to the category. I think it will be easier for you. One category we group formal questions, other are substantial questions. So just to start with the formal one, so that after we can go into the substance, because these are the most of the questions that we're getting right now. You're referring to a dialogue, but what shape shall it take? How to structure it, and how to take its results into consideration? Furthermore, will there be funding for organizing local events? Do you foresee the adoption of online gatherings and in-person meetings? Yes, I guess so. So these are the formal questions that we got. And one more, for the impact of the conference on the future of Europe, do you think it is problematic that the Council has already made clear in its position of June 2020 that the conference does not fall in the scope under the scope of Article 48 TEU? We have some specialists online, it seems. Thank you. These are for the formal questions.
Sì, adesso.
Yes, well, I thought a year ago when we started thinking about how we might go about organizing this conference, we were thinking of a whole score of initiatives, experiments to promote participation and support it. Obviously, we all know that we're now in a very difficult time. We live in very difficult times, and so a lot of our ideas will have to be re-examined in the light of COVID and the impossibility, at least for a while, to be able to move about. Obviously, it will be the remit of the executive organizer of the conference, if we can get it off the ground soon, to devise how this participation should take shape. We had thought about citizens' agoras to be active in all our member states. We had thought of institutional conferences, political events, networks of universities and research centers, but now, obviously, we need to re-examine all this because we have a limited range of activities, and a lot of activities can only be done remotely, and this might be a limitation, but it doesn't mean that we don't have the possibility to develop another range of ways and means. Article 48, for those who are unaware of it, has to do with changes in the treaties, which is why previously I have said that we don't want to already say what the institutional processes along which the conclusions of the conference should be. Let's leave it open. Let's not limit ourselves, our actions, our imagination. We are not just looking at this conference with a preset goal in mind. This is not necessary. What is necessary, what we do need, is to find a new breath of fresh air. And then we could go and see what the processes, even institutional, might be to translate these new rules into reality. There could be very many ways of doing this. We have treaties that allow us a lot of ways, even perhaps ones that we've never thought about before and we've never gone down before. This isn't the problem. The problem is the conference. We need to say clearly that everything that will be changed, will be updated in our democratic system, will be done in a dialogue with our citizens. If democracy does not find again the sense and the reason of participation that means something, then it risks its very existence. I think this is the spirit we need to keep. If we now start to say the conference will produce, and then we come up with a shopping list of everything that everybody's thinking about, I think we would be wrong. It would be a mistake, and we would also give the feeling to other institutions that we already have a preordained way of going ahead, and we do not want this.
Thank you very much. And last formal question. Are the three institutions going to issue a common paper on the organization of the conference on the future of Europe, its composition and governance, and when?
Sì, guardi.
Well, right now, the Parliament, the Council of Ministers, so the current presidency and the Commission are thinking on how this conference can be launched under the flag of the EU institutions, with an executive committee formed by participants from all three institutions, who will very quickly have to have a look again and update what we had thought about, also taking into account the fact that we have to work remotely. This is what we have to do very quickly. It is the most important thing right now, because if we want to reach some goals in this legislature by the next year and a half or thereabouts, we need to at least have an initial set of conclusions, which obviously have to be shared by everyone. We don't want to exclude anything, but at the same time, we need to give ourselves the means to be convincing enough that we can develop a set of strong conclusions. There is no point in thinking about castles in the sky if then we don't have enough consensus to promote reforms. I think this is the right spirit, and obviously I am convinced that down the road, the consensus and awareness of the other institutions on this need to update our system will also develop and strengthen, so that the European model can better work. I think this is the way to go right now. We mustn't exclude anything, but at the same time, we have to work so that we can get to realistic and shared conclusions.
Thank you very much. One more question on the formal aspects. I think we can, for attendees, we can deal with formal aspects until 11:30, and then the last 30 minutes we will deal with substantial issues. So another question is, isn't there a risk that this kind of dialogue only sees the participation of citizens that already have a positive and general knowledge of the EU? How to gather a relevant input from the general public to increase the EU legitimacy and address key issues?
Guardi, questo è un rischio.
Well, this is the risk, obviously. But I'm also convinced that if we throw out the right bait, there will be an increased interest also on behalf of those who are perhaps a bit less aware or less informed. It is up to us to see how to develop the interest of a lot of spheres of the population that need to feel involved. I'm thinking about universities, the work sector, companies. we must never be satisfied and rest on our laurels, but if we can find consolation in this last 18 months, is that we have seen a different mood in vis-a-vis our decisions and the European Union. Even the latest polls from Eurobarometer show that the huge majority of EU citizens want a more powerful Europe, a Europe with more powers. COVID has brought home the message that not one country can save itself on its own, that cooperation and solidarity are absolutely necessary to face a global world challenge. And I think that this awareness is only increasing. I think that some distances are shortening. And so we have to continue along this way. But doing what? Showing that Europe is actually useful to every citizen in their lives, because there's only one rule whereby one can be in love with Europe, and that is that Europe answers the problems, the needs that everyone has. That's why the tools that have been fielded try to keep the balance between pragmatism, so the ability to intervene in daily difficulties, and vision. These two are the elements that we have to strengthen and balance to strengthen our relationship between Europe and its citizens. You know, you're studying, you're thinking about it, and I'm sure you're thinking about this as well. When is democracy deemed useless? When citizens lose their love for democracy, when democracy is unable to face your problems, when democracy becomes just a fortress of red tape, when democracy is removed from everyday life, which is why we need an efficient, an effective, a quick democracy. And so we need to change a lot of mechanisms to improve. But right now, there is one reality we can count on. No one would be able to face on their own a crisis such as the pandemic crisis. And this is a huge lesson. Obstacles can actually allow us to find common responses. This is what's happened this last year. Why have we been able to have instruments that would have been unimaginable a few years ago? Because the challenges were everybody's, because we were able to work on the common debt together, because everyone is spending huge amounts of money. When the challenges are common, then we can act more quickly to find common answers. And the common answers are Europe. I was saying it earlier. This year has been full of lessons about ourselves, about how we work, about our efficacy, about our efficiency. We can't just then put the lessons in a drawer and shut the drawer. We have to absolutely use them to enrich ourselves. One of our founding fathers had already understood this after the war. It will be crisis that will favor European advance. and democracy. Jean Monnet had already understood this, and we're seeing it now. The crisis is increasing our ability to answer together. It doesn't mean that everything is fine, that we don't have any difference of views, but it does mean that we are in a common on a common road, in the same boat. And this is very important to go forward. Some have tried to live through COVID as a sort of parenthesis in time, which is why we're also fighting so that some of the novelties that we've come up with because of this crisis become permanent. This is a big debate that is ongoing, and we have to face it with responsibility and wisdom. But I am convinced that we can't go back from this experience. We can't rewind and go back. We can't do that. I think that the current experience of the European Union will be able to make us imagine new ways and means to build the future of Europe and the Europe of the future.
Thank you very much. The last formal questions, which is also a kind of conclusion on this aspect. Is there a chance for finishing the conference on the future of Europe in spring 2022, as it was initially announced? And does it matter, or why would it matter? Thank you.
We haven't even started it yet. So it's not easy for us to say when it's going to finish. We thought a year ago to use up the first part of the term to reach conclusions, and then the second part of the term to support the proposals for the conference, to come out with a number of proposals. Of course, this is the roadmap, but we need to update it. Approximately, I think that if we start quite quickly, by June 2022, we might have a first draft conclusion, a first conclusion of the conference. That doesn't mean that the conference should be stopped. Maybe the conference can go on and deal with other aspects. It will depend on when we start, how the first debates will take place, how the executive committee will establish the timing. Unfortunately, I cannot anticipate conclusions because I can't do that. We're still waiting for a decision, an important decision from Coreper, namely the Representatives Committee, on behalf of the national governments. Perhaps tomorrow we might have a first reply. Yesterday I saw all the ambassadors and I urged them to put forward this, to make this decision. No, we're waiting for their decision.
Thank you very much. So now we will switch to substantial issues. So just to remind the attendees, what President Sassoli already made clear is that we cannot preclude in advance what the issues that will be dealt with will be. It is up to the citizens and all the dialogues that will be put into place to decide on these issues. So you can now put your questions regarding substantial issues. The first one, which is pretty big, so I will just focus on this one first. I would be grateful if President Sassoli could share with us his thoughts about tensions and misunderstandings regarding matters such as the rule of law, liberal democracy, corruption, migration, and gender policies. Impatience and resentment are growing in certain circles. How to trust that the Conference on the Future of Europe conclusions will be taken into consideration if already now the EU cannot find an agreement on these issues?
An agreement. Well, it depends. In Europe, I think people now are focusing on the same issues. We don't have to consider democracy as a sort of push to reach a single thought, a single approach. Democracy is a debate, is dialogue, is common interest. That's why democracy is so beautiful. If we manage, unlike in the past, to have a sort of Europe which is focused on itself, that drops all those rhetoric on sovereignism, of nationalism, I think this will bring about a more open debate, a more interesting one. The first years of this century, we were faced with a great deal of fear. Fear to work together. Nationalism. After all, what is nationalism? It's just recognizing that the others are worse than you. You are the best, better than your neighbor. That's what it's about. We know how much damage this ideology brought about. Yesterday there was the Remembrance Day of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was remembered, what it meant in the history of last century and in the history of Europe. We must drop this point of view. We're not the best. We're not better than our neighbors. And we can work together, cooperate with our neighbors. That's the major European adventure of the last 70 years. But now maybe it's not enough. It's no longer enough for two reasons. First of all, there are so many forces that are concentrating on dividing Europe. We've just seen this in the recent past. How many people, how many circles have worked to divide Europe in the south, in the north, west, east? Of course, just look at the experience of Federica Mogherini as High Representative. She can tell us something about that. And she can answer better than me to these questions. But I think at the moment there are certain circles are not really supported by everyone. For example, at the end of last year and last week in the United States, there is a new president, which is something more than something. A lot of people were referring to the past American president, but if we had managed to have more cooperation with that president, we would have dealt with the COVID threat better. We would have worked better for our fellow citizens, but that was not the case. COVID was the first global challenge that Europe had to face on its own, without our natural partners, traditional partners, without a big ally. such as the United States. I do hope that we all hope we have good signs now at the beginning of that presidency. We saw a new president of the United States taking up his position on the Paris Agreement. The new president of the United States went back to the WHO, whereas Trump left it. So we had signals that he's willing to resume the dialogue and work on a multilateral option, which is the identity card, in a way, of Europe. We always encourage that policy. So I hope that most of your remarks relate to the past rather than to the future. Because if there is a different political scene in the world, hopefully we'll have a different setting and it will be much better, much more useful. There are a number of threats that we need to face in the Mediterranean, on our borders. So many things are happening, very dangerous things, and they have all of this has got an impact on all of us. For example, let's think of what the Mediterranean might be in terms of cooperation, stability. This is not happening at the moment. We can't simply thinking about ourselves. We must be proud, must be strong, but we cannot limit ourselves to strengthen our living standard. We have to see how Europe can be useful for the others, be useful, for the neighbors. Last week, I met two friends of mine, the president of Georgia and the president of Moldova, two small countries of the eastern neighborhood, and they both come from poor countries which are in trouble. They belong to Europe and they feel they belong to our family too. We must be careful, we must care. We have to establish solidarity with them. They need our vaccines. We must be generous. We must have a vision. And understanding that generosity can strengthen ourselves, can be good for ourselves. We must think that the safety of the Western Balkans is linked to our safety. So we need to have a different vision, a new look at things. So the lessons that COVID taught us should lead us to be more trustful compared to the past, when we're very much on the defense. A lot of people bet on our divisions. We had a very bad experience in the last few years, but we were able to deal with it with unity, and we overcame that threat, the difficulties. We were quite good at doing that. I'm talking about Brexit. The UK, a friend of ours, were close to this country, but they decided to leave us. That is maybe a good example, because Europe was united. All the European institutions were more than united. All the national governments agreed to share the same opinion, the same point of view. As a result of that is that we could defend peace for them and our interest. So I think it is a successful experience. Europe, in such a difficult time, it was torn because of Brexit, but nonetheless, Europe, without showing, its power, just showed its sense of responsibility and got through it.
Grazie. David, if I can take it over now, Karina, I think you've covered a lot of content-related issues, and indeed the questions are so many that it would be difficult to cover them all in the limited time we have for this morning, but I'm sure that many of them would come back in the 2 days of work we have during the conference. Maybe, David, I will ask you only one last question that one of our students asks, and I think you can find it interesting to respond to this, given the nature of our audience. And the question is, what can we do as a young generation to improve the situation in Europe? And interestingly enough, the question comes from a student from Ukraine and not from the European Union countries, to reinforce the messages that you were sending about our Eastern neighbors.
I believe that now there's something fundamental. Everyone must do its duty. Your duty is studying, because we need you. We need wiseness. We need to change the system mechanism. So we need people that know these mechanisms. Some unprecedented operations, we were successful. Why? Because we stepped in and changed the rules. This is not some work that people like monks can do, but responsible citizens can do that. So knowing the mechanisms in order to change them, possibly. So this is something that you have to take up for us, for the future. And that's the meaning of your engagement, of your intellectual engagement, of your work there. Do not believe that what you're doing is only for few people. No, it will be for many people and for all of us. That is the first thing. Secondly, from information, knowledge, research, so many unprecedented opportunities will come up, which we don't know yet. If there is a message I can send out to you, that is my message. Your duty, your work is fundamental for our future. Your activity and, the work of so many other students, future professionals. So I feel that all of this will have some meaning. And what is the meaning? Well, our ownership, the sense of belonging as our fellow citizens, as citizens. It is not just a detail, it is a big thing of the construction of the European Union, of the history of Europe. And there is something else which we should take into account. Think about it. We have Europe with 27 countries, so many sensitivities, interest, etc., as is right. What is the function of the European Union? in this space, which is so rich, well, it just making the gap shorter. Well, let's put it this way. COVID taught us that we all have common challenges to deal with. And those challenges allow us to make the distance between the countries and our citizens shorter. So what is Europe I would like to see, to have in future? And this is the Europe you're going to build. Well, Europe where the southern problems are understood by the northern citizens. The question, the issues of the eastern countries are felt as common problems by the society of our southern country, southern Europe. I was particularly struck when I went to Finland. It was before COVID time. I spoke to the Finnish government, and I saw they were very, very committed to defend their border with Russia. How many southern citizens know what it means to have such a defense expenditure to defend, to protect 1,200 kilometers of border with Russia? They don't know about it, and we don't feel that as our problem in the south. Finland is a large country with a small number of inhabitants and a military expenditure which is very, very high in our opinion, and so much so that the citizens have got to do the military service up to the age of 50 years old. So if you go to Finland and talk about the Mediterranean problems, it is likely that they will say the same. That is, they won't understand the problems we're dealing with in the south. So I think that what we need to do, because it's important, it's very useful, is to shorten the distance, the gap. And it is on this that we decide our future and the future of our fellow citizens.
Grazie David. Certamente il messaggio ai nostri studenti sarà ribadito: studiare, 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 conoscere i meccanismi per poterli cambiare e aiutarci a ridurre la distanza. You would allow me just one sentence in Italian, because it's, I know that our time is over now, but our works will continue starting 1 p.m. sharp, and we will have today and tomorrow detailed sessions with all different stakeholders participating to that, including students. We will produce papers on content and on methods that we will make sure you will receive. That might be an inspiration for the institutional work of the conference on the future of Europe. And who knows, maybe we will see if this conference we organized, the College of Europe, could accompany the institutional process along the way and maybe become a regular appointment for us all to bridge the gap and help involving especially the younger generations and the world of academia in this dialogue on our future. Davide, grazie moltissimo per averci dedicato questa ora e più del tuo tempo. Ti auguro buon lavoro e spero di vederti presto.
Facciamo una cosa, Federica.
Let's do this. Once the conference is launched, halfway down the road, let's meet again.
This is a formal invitation, l'accettiamo immediatamente. Allora diciamo che speriamo non più tardi di qualche mese fissiamo una data e sicuramente speriamo di vederti di persona a Bruges per fare un follow-up di questa conferenza. Grazie mille David, thank you very much. For all the participants, 1 p.m. sharp restart. Grazie, buon lavoro, buona giornata.
Grazie.